Chapter 3 of Life in a Medieval City. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Yearsley. Life in a Medieval City, illustrated by York in the 15th century, by Edwin Benson. Chapter 3. Appearance. A. General appearance. A general view of 15th century York, Everwyck in Anglo-French and Eboracum in Latin, would give the impression of a very compact city within fortifications. Almost immediately it would be noticed how the three great elements of national society were very clearly reflected in the general appearance. First, the church, the tremendous and ubiquitous power of which is emphasized by the strikingly beautiful and wonderfully constructed massive minster, but so recently completed, standing with its more than 500 feet of length, its central tower 200 feet high, most of its roofs 100 feet or more above the ground, dwarfing the petty storied dwellings. This is but one great church. In brilliant contrast, in another quarter adjoining the city, is the great abbey church of St. Mary, crowned by a lofty and magnificent spire, rising above the equally fine conventual buildings. All over the city are seen the churches and buildings of other monastic and religious houses. The background of dwellings and shops, built in a similar style, is cut by a few winding streets, and studded with the towers, spires, and roofs of the multitude of parish churches. The intense and far-reaching influence of the church in all phases of life is indelibly marked on this city. The great influence of the royal state, second only to that of the church, appears in the enclosing fortifications, and especially in the solid stance of the castle, where the keep stands out stoutly on its fortified mound. The whole castle, self-supporting within its own defences, its massive walls, broad moats, outer and inner wards, protected gateways, drawbridges, and other tactical devices, conveys an impression of power. On the Bishop Hill side of the river there remains the mound, Bailey Hill, on which the other castle was erected by order of William the Conqueror. The whole city is enclosed by a defensive works consisting of an embattled wall on a mound, with a moat or protecting ditch running parallel to it. At intervals along the walls there are towers. Where the four main roads enter the city there are the four gateways or bars, high enough to act as watch-towers, and fit by their solid construction to offer a stout defence. The royal state keeps its stern watch around and within. The third great element, the people, are represented by the few narrow winding streets, and the crowded houses, sending up blue smoke from their hearths, clustering round the great buildings of church and state. The town itself is almost entirely in the eastern sector of the city. On the western side the houses are grouped along the river bank, and between Micklegate Bar and Ouse Bridge. There are several monasteries and churches in this section also. The third estate, the closely living masses, the people, has its outstanding buildings, but these are of comparatively local and small importance. Although the city and guild halls stand out utilitarian yet beautiful above the dwelling houses, yet they are not at all so prominent as the great erections of the church and the state. A glance over the city today from the walls or the top of a church tower emphasizes the dominance of the cathedral over the whole city. The castle keep, Clifford's Tower, is still an important feature in the view. There were as rivals neither factories nor great commercial offices in the 15th century city. St. Clement's Nunnery and 6 churches, of which 3 were not far from Walmgate Bar, and 1 was near Monk Bar, were actually outside the city walls. Without the city, and the cultivated land nearby, most of the country consisted of great stretches of forest, that is, wood, marsh, moor, wasteland. Footnote: forest is derived from Latin fortis, meaning outside, without the city. End footnote. This surrounding forest land was crossed by the few high roads leading to and from the city, which they entered through the bars. The country was not all wild and tenantless, for here and there scattered about were baronial castles and estates, and monastic houses and lands, all of which had their farming. In the forests there were villages, each consisting of a few houses grouped together for common security, where lived minor officials and men working in the forest. The great forest of Galtres, to the north of York, was a royal domain. In the 15th century the population of York, the greatest city of the north, was about 14,000. Newcastle was the next greatest, being one of the 10 or 12 leading cities of mediaeval England, which had a total population of about 2.5 millions. The inhabitants of York registered in 1911 numbered 83,802. Within the city there was a number of sub-entities, each self-contained and definitely marked off, often by enclosing, embattled walls. Such was the Minster, which stood within its close. The liberty of the Minster of St. Peter included the parts of the city immediately round the Minster, the Archbishop's Palace, and the Bedern, a small district in the city where some of the Minster clergy lived collegiately, and groups of houses and odd dwellings scattered throughout other parts of the city and the county, and elsewhere. Individual monasteries formed further such sub-entities, for instance St. Mary's Abbey, which was actually outside the city walls, but within its own defensive walls, the Franciscan Friary near the castle, Holy Trinity Priory, the Royal Hospital of St. Leonard. The castle, which obviously had to be enclosed and capable of maintaining and enduring isolation, was independent of the city. Each of these ecclesiastical institutions enjoyed a large measure of freedom from the rule of the municipal authorities. The city was also subdivided into parishes, which of course were not enclosed by walls. The parish boundaries, although less well defined than those of the areas above mentioned, were none the less distinctly marked. B. Streets. Streets, as we use the word today, were quite few in number. They were usually called gates, and were mostly continuations of the great high roads that came into and through the city, after crossing the wild country that covered most of northern England, a desert in which a city was an oasis and a sanctuary. In the lofty and graceful open lantern tower of All Saints' pavement, a lamp was hung to guide belated travellers to the safety and hospitality that obtained within the city walls. For the same purpose a bell was rung at St. Michael's, Ouse Bridge. There were a few buildings along the high roads just outside the great entrances, the bars. Besides the few hovels and huts, there were hospitals for travellers. There were 4 hospitals for lepers, the most wretched of all the sufferers from mediaeval lack of cleanliness. Most of the streets were mere alleys, passages between houses and groups of buildings. They were very narrow, and often the sky could hardly be seen from them, because of the overhanging upper stories of the buildings along each side. Goods in the Middle Ages, and right down to the 19th century, were carried in towns by hand. Carriages and wagons and carts were not very numerous, and would have no need to proceed beyond the main streets and the open squares. If men must journey off their own feet, they rode horses. Pack horses were used regularly to carry goods, where nowadays a horse, or more probably a steam or motor engine, would easily pull the goods conveniently placed on a cart or lorry. The paving of rough cobbles and ample mud was distinctly poor. There was no adequate drainage. In fact, there was very little attempt at any, beyond the provision of gutters down the middle or at the sides of the streets. There were no regular street lights, and pavements, when they existed, were too meagre to be of much use to pedestrians. Streets led to the 2 open market-places of this mediaeval city. Both of them, Thursday Market, now called St. Sampson's Square, and Pavement, which was a broad street with a market cross near one end, were used as markets, but for different kinds of produce. Some markets, such as the cattle market, were held in the streets. These 2 market-places were the principal public open spaces, parts of a town that are given such importance in modern town planning schemes. Other open spaces were the cloisters and gardens of the monasteries, the courts of the castle, the graveyards of the churches, and private gardens. In spite of these and the passage of a tidal river through the city, it cannot be denied that the inhabitants of our mediaeval city lived in rather dirty and badly ventilated surroundings. The river Ouse was crossed by one bridge, which was of stone, with houses and shops of wood built up from the body of the bridge. The arches were small, and afford a striking contrast to later constructions, in which a wide central arch replaced the 2 central small arches. The quays were just below the bridge. At one end of Ouse Bridge was St. William's Chapel, a beautiful little church, as we know from the fragments of it that remain. Footnote: a church that was in a parish, but was not the parish church, was called a chapel. The parish church was the principal and parents' church of all within the parish. End footnote. Adjoining the chapel was the Sheriff's Court. On the next story was the Exchequer Court. Then there was the common prison, called the Kidcote, while above these were other prisons which continued round the back of the chapel. Next to the prisons were the council chamber and muniment room. Opposite the chapel were the court-house, called the Tolbooth. Footnote: compare the Tolbooth, Edinburgh, and the Toll House, Yarmouth. End footnote. And the debtors' prison, and a maison Dieu, that is, a kind of almshouse. The present streets, called Shambles, formerly Mangergate, footnote, French, Manger, end footnote, Finkel Street, Jubbergate, Petergate, and especially Shambles, Little Shambles, and the passages leading from them, help one to realise the appearance of mediaeval streets and ways. C. Buildings. Dwelling houses ranged from big town residences of noble or distinguished families, by way of the beautifully decorated costly houses of the rich middle-class merchants, to the humble dwellings of the poorest inhabitants. Every type of house, from the palace to the hovel, was well represented. The Archbishop's palace, consisting of hall, chapel, quadrangle, mint, and gateway with prison, was near the minster. Beyond the fine 13th century chapel, now part of the Minster Library buildings, hardly a trace of this undoubtedly splendid residence is left. The Percys had a great mansion in Walmgate. In other parts were the mansions of the Scropes and the Vavasours. It is, however, the houses of the prosperous traders that are the most interesting, for in them we see the kind of house a man built from the results of successful business. Most houses were of timber. Those of the more wealthy were of stone and timber. The use of half-timbering, when the face of a building consisted of woodwork and plaster, made houses and streets very picturesque. The woodwork was often artistically carved. Each story was made to overhang the one below it, so that an umbrella, if umbrella had been in use then, would have been almost a superfluity, if not a needless luxury, besides being impossible to manipulate in the narrow streets and ways of a mediaeval city. The upper stories of two houses facing each other across a street were often very close. Usually there were no more than 3 stories. The roofs were very steep and covered generally with tiles, but in the case of the smaller dwellings, with thatch. From a housetop the view across the neighbourhood would be of a huddled medley of red-tiled roofs, all broken up with gables and tiny dormer windows. There would be no regularity, just a jumble of patches of red-tiled roofing. The present streets, called Shambles, Pavement, Petergate, and Stonegate, contain excellent examples of mediaeval domestic architecture. Shops were distinguished by having the front of the ground floor arranged as a showroom, warehouse, or business room, which was open to the street. The trader lived at his shop. In the case of a butcher's, for example, the front part of the shutters that covered the unglazed window at night was let down in business hours, so that it hung over the footway. On it were exhibited the joints of meat. Butchers' slaughter-houses were then, as now, private premises, and right in the heart of the city. The rooms in the houses were quite small, with low ceilings. The small windows, whether they were merely fitted with wooden shutters or glazed with many small panes kept together with strips of lead, lighted the rooms but poorly. The closeness of the houses made internal lighting still less effective. The interior walls were of timbering and plaster, often white or colour-washed. Footnote: wallpaper, which still bears the influence of the hangings that it replaced, came into general use early in the 19th century. End footnote. Panelling was used occasionally. The ventilation and hygienic conditions generally were far from good, as may be imagined from a consideration of the smallness of the houses, the compactness of the city, particularly the parts occupied by the people, and especially of the primitive system of sanitation, which was content to use the front street as a main sewer. There were, of course, no drains. At most there was a gutter along the middle of a street, or at each side of the roadway. It was the traditional practice to dump house and workshop refuse into the streets. Some of it was carried along by rainwater, but generally it remained. In any case it was noxious and dangerous. There was legislation on the subject, for the evil was already notorious in the 14th century. The first parliamentary attempt to restrain people in towns generally from thus corrupting and infecting the air is dated 1388. The many visits of distinguished people and public processions always conferred an incidental boon on the city, for one of the essentials of preparation was giving the main streets a good cleaning. There is no wonder that plagues perpetually harassed the people of mediaeval times, and reduced the population miserably. The plague never disappeared till towns were largely rebuilt on a more commodious scale in the next great building era, which began in 1666 in London, and in the early years of the 18th century elsewhere. No advance was made in sanitation till the Victorian age, when town sanitation was completely revolutionised and for the first time efficiently organised. The house fire was of wood and peat, though coal was also used. For artificial lighting, oil lamps, wicks in oil, and candles were used. A light was obtained from flint and tinder, the latter being ignited by a spark got from striking the flint with a piece of metal. Rooms were furnished with chairs, tables, benches, chests, bedsteads, and in some cases tub-shaped baths. Carpets were to be found only in the houses of the very wealthy. The floors of ordinary houses, like those of churches, were covered with rushes and straw, among which it was the useful custom to scatter fragrant herbs. This rough carpet was pressed by the clogs of working people and the shoes of the fashionable. The spit was a much-used cooking utensil. Tablecloths, knives, and spoons were in general use, but not the fork before the 15th century. At one time food was manipulated by the fingers. York was advanced in table manners, for it is known that a fork was used in the house of a citizen family here in 1443. The richer members of the middle class owned a large number of silver tankards, goblets, mazer bowls, salt cellars, and similar utensils and ornaments of silver, for this was the common form in which they held their wealth. Beer, which was largely brewed at home, was the general beverage, but French and other wines were plentiful. The water supply came from wells, the water being drawn up by bucket and windlass, or from the river when the wells were low. The drinking water of the 20th century city is taken entirely from the river Ouse, but now the water is carefully treated and purified before reaching the consumer. There were not many inns, as is shown in records by the number of inn-holders who formed a trade company. There were also wine dealers. Typical inn signs were the Bull in Coney Street and the Dragon. There is no reason to believe that in this century there was a really large amount of drinking and drunkenness, such as there was in the 18th century. An ordinance of the Marshals of 1409, "No man of the craft shall go to inns, but if he is sent after, under pain of fourpence," may be quoted. The houses of the wealthy and the great lords were, of course, the better furnished. They had walls adorned with tapestries, and hung with arras or hangings. Occasionally their walls were panelled. Their furniture was rich, well constructed, and carved by skilled craftsmen. Their mansions were large, for they had to house, besides the owner's family and personal householders, retainers and dependents attached to his service in diverse capacities. Civic buildings consisted chiefly of the halls connected with the trade guilds. The rulers of the city and of the guilds were often the same men, in any case usually men of the same set. These secular buildings were really distinguished in appearance, but not monumental. They reflected something of the wealth that accrued from trade. They were of good size and proportions, built to be worthy of the practical use for which they were intended. The lower stages were of stone, the upper for the most part of wood and plaster, half timbering. The structural framework was composed of stout beams and posts of timber. The timber roofs were covered with tiles. Examples may be seen in the Merchants' Hall, Fossgate, and St. Anthony's Hall in Peasholm Green. The wooden roof of the Guild Hall, which was the common hall, erected in the 15th century, is supported by wooden columns. The walls of this hall and the entire basement are of stone. Of Davy Hall, the King's administrative offices and prison for the Royal Forest of Galtres, not a trace remains to show the kind of buildings they were. The fortifications consisted of the castle and the city walls with their gateways. The massive stone keep of the castle was on a high artificial mound at the city end of the enclosed area occupied by the castle. Around this mound there was a moat or deep, broad ditch filled with water. The keep, which is in plan like a quatrefoil, consisted of 2 stories. Within, near the entrance, there is a well, the memory of which is for ever stained by the unhappy part it played in one of the most bitter persecutions of the Jews. Beyond the keep there were inner and outer wards, official buildings including the King's Great Hall, the Royal Mint, and barracks for the King's soldiers. The entire castle, which was the residence of the royal governor and a military depot, was surrounded by walls, outside which were moats, or the river, or swamps, according to the position of each side. These moats, or defensive ditches, were crossed by drawbridges. To enter a fortified place in the Middle Ages, one had to pass a barbican, that is, an outwork consisting of a fortified wall along each side of the one way, a drawbridge across the moat, a portcullis or gate of stoutly intercrossing timbers, set horizontally and vertically with only a small space between any two beams, giving the whole gate the appearance of a large number of small square holes, each surrounded by solid wood, that could be lowered or raised at will in grooves at the sides of the entrance opening. The ends of the vertical posts at the bottom formed a row of spikes, which were shod with iron. The points of these spikes entered the ground when the portcullis was lowered. Beyond there were the wooden gates of the inner opening. The city walls, of which the present remains date from the reign of Edward III, were broad, crenellated walls of limestone, on a high mound, which was protected without by a parallel deep moat. At the north, east, south, and west corners there were massive bastions, and between these, at short intervals, smaller towers. Beside being crenellated, the raised front of the wall itself was often pierced with slits shaped for the use of long or crossbows. The bowmen were very well protected by these skilful arrangements. Some of these slits, shaped like crosses, were of exquisite design architecturally. The continuity of these mural fortifications was broken only where swamps and the rivers made them unnecessary, and where roads passed through them. The four principal entrances along the main high roads were defended by the four bars or fortified gateways. These, with their barbicans, three of which were so needlessly and callously destroyed in the last century, were magnificent examples of noble, permanent military architecture. The outer façade of Monk Bar today, spoiled as it is, expresses a noble strength. There was formerly only the single way, both for ingress and egress. Footnote: the view today from Petergate towards Bootham Bar gives a good impression of a narrow main street, with gabled houses, leading to the single fortified opening provided by the bar. End footnote. The bar was supported on each side by the mound and wall, which latter led right into the bar, and so to the corresponding wall on the other side. Each of these entrances to the city was protected by barbican, portcullis, and gate. Each evening the bars were closed, and the city shut in for the night. Defenders used a bar as a watchtower or a fort. They could walk along the high crenellated walls of the barbican and shoot thence, and stop the way by lowering the portcullis. Footnote: the winch and portcullis are still in existence in Monk Bar, and in working order. End footnote. Near the castle there were the castle mills, where the machinery was driven by water power. Outside the walls there were strays, or common lands. Some of the land immediately around the city was cultivated or used as pasture. There were, besides dwellings, several churches and hospitals, just outside the city. Beyond this suburban area was the forest. The most notable of the religious buildings is the minster, which was practically completed in the 15th century, when the work of erecting the three towers was finished. The architectural splendour of this mighty church must have appealed very strongly to the people of the 15th century, for did they not see the great work that had gone on for centuries at last brought to this glorious conclusion? It rose up in the midst of the city, always visible from near and far. The inside was even more magnificent than the exterior. The fittings and furniture were of the richest. The light mellow tone of the white stonework was enhanced by the fleeting visions of colour that spread across the sunlit stained glass windows, which still, in spite of time and restoration, add enormously to the beauty of the interior. The minster stood within its close, one of the four gateways of which, College Street Arch, remains. This part of the city around the minster was enclosed because it was under the jurisdiction of the Liberty of St. Peter. Originally founded in 627 by Edwin, King of Northumbria, the minster had been rebuilt and enlarged from time to time. It received its final and present form in the 15th century. At one time the nave was rebuilt. At the same time there was built, near but separate from the main building, the chapter house, a magnificent octagonal Parliament house of one immense chamber. Later the chapter house was connected with the main building by the vestibule. Then the choir was replaced by a larger and finer building in the then latest architectural fashion. The new choir contained the east window, which in the eyes of contemporaries was wonderful and unrivalled for its size and painted glass. It occupies nearly all the central space of the east wall, from a few feet above the ground to almost the apex of the gable. Gothic architecture was so marvellously adaptable that all these parts, built at widely different times at various and strongly contrasted stages of the development of this English mediaeval architecture, together make a single building that appears to possess the most felicitous unity of general design and a perfectly wonderful diversity of sectional design, for every part is in complete sympathy with the scheme as a whole. To the east of the central tower is the choir, which was kept exclusively for the services. To the west, the nave, the popular part. The entrance to the choir from the west is made through the stone screen of kings, which, with the lofty organ which rests on it, prevents people in the nave from getting anything more than a glimpse of what is taking place in the choir. Over the western ends of the nave aisles are the twin west towers, which contain the bells. The high altar and reredos stood in the middle of the choir between the two choir transepts, the huge windows of which present in picture the life stories of St. Cuthbert and St. William respectively. The Lady Chapel, the part of the choir to the east of the reredos, was very important in pre-Reformation days, when the cult of the Virgin was very popular. To the north and south of the central tower are the transepts. From the north transept the vestibule leads to the chapter house. The church is therefore of the shape of a cross, the centre of which is marked by the central tower, with an octagonal building standing near and connected with the northern arm. The furniture was of wood and elaborately carved. In the choir were the fixed stalls, with towering canopies, and other seats, which were ranged along the north and south sides, and at the west end. Chapels were marked off by wooden screens, often of elaborate tracery. The cost of erecting this huge and splendid church must have been enormous. The minster contained the shrine of St. William of York, which, like those of St. Cuthbert at Durham and St. Thomas at Canterbury, of European fame, attracted streams of pilgrims, whose donations helped the funds of erection and maintenance. This was an established means of raising funds for church purposes. There was also the money from penances and indulgences. The archbishops were keenly interested in their cathedral church. Citizens gave and bequeathed sums of money to the minster funds. In addition, the minster authorities received gifts from wealthy nobles of the north of England. The house of Vavasour, for instance, supplied stone. That of Percy gave wood, to be used in building the great metropolitical church. If the money cost was enormous, the completed building, for design, engineering, and decorative work, in stone, wood, cloth, stained glass, was far beyond monetary value. The nave, the part open to the public, was used for processions. Some started from the great west door, entrance through which was a rare privilege granted only to the highest. The choir was the scene of the daily services of the 7 offices of the day. All around, in the aisles and transepts, were altars in side chapels, chantry chapels, where throughout the early part of the day priests were saying masses for the souls of the departed. There were 30 chantries in the minster. Footnote: the Leshman Chantry Chapel in Hexham Abbey is a typical example in excellent preservation. A small erection of stone and wood, it stands between 2 of the piers of the north choir arcade. In small compass there are a stone altar with 5 crosses, an aumbrey beneath the altar, and the tomb, with recumbent effigy of the founder. A priest would have just sufficient room to move about in the performance of his service. Part of Archbishop Bowett's tomb in York Minster was a chantry chapel. End footnote. The minster has from its foundation been a cathedral. The chapter of canons, with the dean at their head, has always been its governing body. As a church it was served by prebendaries or canons, who had definite periods of duty annually, and 2 residential bodies of priests, of whom some, the chantry priests, lived at St. William's College. This college was erected shortly after the middle of the 15th century. On the site there had been Salton House, the prebendal residence of the Prior of Hexham, who was canon of Salton. This picturesque building of stone, wood, half timberwork, and tiled roofs is a little to the east of the minster. It consists of a series of rooms ranged round a central courtyard. It is of much historical interest, and since it was restored recently to be the home of the Convocation of the Northern Province, it has returned to the service of the church. The minor canons, or vicars choral, who were employed by the canons as their deputies, also lived in community. They had their hall, chapel, and other buildings in an enclosed part called the Bedern, not far from the minster. As a counterpart to the minster, in appearance as in use, was the great rich Benedictine abbey of St. Mary, of royal foundation, with a mitred abbot, who sat among the Lords Spiritual in Parliament. St. Mary's was perhaps the most important of the northern monasteries. The buildings were proportionally large and fine. The church, dating mostly from the 13th and 14th centuries, was particularly long and had a tall spire. It was only a little inferior to the minster in magnificence. On the south side were the cloisters, the open-air workplace and recreation place of the monks, while beyond were the conventual buildings, such as the calefactory or warming-house, the dormitories, and the refectory or room where meals were taken. The cloisters were square in plan, and consisted of a central grass plot, along the sides of which there was a continuous covered walk with unglazed windows facing the central open space. Benedictine abbeys usually conformed to a common scheme as regards the planning of the church and the conventual buildings. The cloisters were only one of the courts or open squares which separated groups of conventual buildings. Further, there were gardens and orchards. Nearer the river there was the hospitium, or guest-house, where visitors were lodged. The abbey was within its own walls, and on one side its grounds extended to the river. The gateway, comprising gate, lodge, and chapel, was on the north side. Near the castle there was an extensive Franciscan friary. On the other side of the river there was the Priory of the Holy Trinity, the home of an alien Benedictine order. A Carmelite friary in Hungate, opposite the castle, seems, from the few odd fragments of stone that remain, to have had fine buildings. The Augustinian friary was between Lendal and the river. The Dominican house, which was burnt down in 1455, was on the site of the old railway station. The only nunnery in the city was the Benedictine Priory of St. Clement. There were sisterhoods in St. Leonard's and other hospitals. It should, however, be noted there were many nunneries in the districts round York. Some of the religious institutions were called hospitals. The care of the sick was only one of the functions of this type of religious house. Such was the large and famous St. Leonard's Hospital, a royal institution that was not under the control of a bishop. The beautiful ruins of St. Leonard's, which adjoined St. Mary's Abbey, prove how well this hospital had been built. These hospitals, of which there were 15 in York, were in close touch with the people. While St. Mary's, for instance, was one of the great abbeys, where the monks, by the time when the 15th century was advanced, were living luxuriously, easily, and generally unproductively, the religious of the hospitals and lesser houses were still engaged in feeding the poor, tending the sick, and educating the children of the people. Each of these religious institutions, whether monastery or hospital, was within its own grounds, bounded by its own walls. Altogether they occupied a large part of the total area of the mediaeval city which their buildings adorned, and of which they were so characteristic a feature. St. Mary's Abbey, which with its buildings and grounds covered a large area, was actually outside the city proper, but it was immediately adjoining it. There were nearly 60 monasteries, priories, hospitals, maisons Dieu, and chapels. The maisons Dieu, of which there were 16, were smaller hospitals. They combined generally the duties of almshouse and chantry. Parish churches, which were the centres of the religious life of the laity, were everywhere. In the 15th century there were 45 churches and 10 chapels, so that there was always a place in church for every citizen. A church was always in use. Besides the regular public services which took place frequently during the day, and the special services for festivals, there were services in chantries. Both the high altar in the chancel and altars in other parts of a church were used. Several altars were necessary because the number of masses, for the celebration of which money was liberally bequeathed, was very large. The parish church was used for other than purely religious purposes. It was the central meeting place of the parish, and might be described as the seat of parochial government. Meetings were held in the nave. Parts of the church were used as schools. The parish church was also the depot for the equipment of those members who became soldiers. Moreover, fire buckets, generally of leather, were often kept in the church, since, being of stone, it was perhaps the safest building in the parish. There were also long poles with hooks at the end, used to pull thatch away from burning houses. Most, if not all, of these churches were fine specimens of the architecture of the Middle Ages, the so-called Gothic architecture, which is characterized by pointed arches, ribbed vaulting, and the constant use of the buttress. These churches were, in contrast to the present condition of most of those that remain, complete with chancel, nave and aisles, towers or spires, bells, stained glass windows, and furniture, many of them being particularly rich in one or more of these features. The painted windows are especially interesting, for they show the standard of this branch of 15th century art, and are valuable historical documents. The rich, mellow tones of colour should be noted, also the incidental pictures of mediaeval dress and furniture. Footnote: besides the exceptional display of 15th century glass in the Minster, notable examples occur in St. Martin's, Coney Street, All Saints', North Street, and Holy Trinity, Goodramgate. End footnote. It is interesting to compare the 15th century work with that done, for instance, by the William Morris firm to the designs of Burne-Jones, 1833 to 1898, at a time when the revived art, with other forms of decoration, was enjoying a period of great success. In the 15th century the church was flourishing, materially at least, and money and gifts were freely given. The offices and services in churches were recited and sung. Organs were used, but were not very large, and were capable of being carried about. Although working on similar principles to the modern organ, they lacked its size, power, and varied capacity. At the Minster there were several organs, for instance the great organs, the organs in the choir, the organs at the altar BVM. The chancel was the most sacred part of the church, for there was the principal or high altar. In the chancel were the stalls or seats of the clergy and officials. The actual seats could be turned up when the occupants wished to stand. Standing for long periods was made less irksome in that the underside of each seat was made with a projecting ledge, which gave some support. It is thoroughly characteristic of the age that this very human device should have existed, and secondly, that these ledges were carved and ornamented. These misericords, as they are called, were usually curiously, even grotesquely, carved. Some of these carvings were founded on natural objects, some were grotesque heads, others represented subjects with man and animals. There were pews for the nobility, but apart from the few old and weak people who used the rough bench or two in the body of the church, or the stone bench that ran along the walls, the general public stood during the services. Wealthy parishioners left money to the parochial clergy, and for the fabric of the church. They generally wished to be buried at some particular place within their parish church. Such distinguished men as Nicholas Blackburne, merchant of York, were commemorated at times in their parish churches by means of stained glass windows. The portraits of Nicholas and his son and their wives appear in the east windows of All Saints', North Street. His arms are also to be seen in this window. D. York as a port. The Ouse was tidal and navigable right up to York. Trade, especially in woolen goods, was carried on in the 15th century by river and sea directly between York and ports on the west coast of the continent, and especially Baltic ports. On arriving at York the boats stopped at the quays, adjacent to which were warehouses, just below Ouse Bridge. The sea-going boats were not large. They were usually one-masted sailing ships, built of wood. They had high prows and sterns, with a capacious hold between. Some of them were built in York. Their trade was such that some of the York merchants, for example the wealthy Howme family, had establishments in foreign ports. The Howmes had property in Calais. The regulation of the waterways in and near the city was vested in the corporation. Matters pertaining to navigation and shipping were adjudged by an Admiralty Court under the King's Admiral, whose jurisdiction extended from the Thames to the northern ports. End of Chapter 3.